Hello, everybody. Thank you for making time today to hang out with us. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mack McMillan. He is the CEO and co-founder of Synergistic Inc., a firm specialized in information security, privacy, and regulatory compliance in healthcare. He is the chair of HIMSS, Privacy and Security Policy Task Force, and brings nearly 40 years of experience from government and private sector positions. He has worked in healthcare industry since his retirement from the government and contributes regularly to thought leadership and compliance, security, and privacy in healthcare. And he sits on several industry advisory boards, as you can see here, such as CHIME, AHIS, and Healthcare Most Wired. Mack has done several educational sessions for some of our clients, and you'll definitely be enlightened and maybe a little scared after this presentation. So we're excited to have him with us at Clarity today. Thank you.
Well, good morning, Heather and everyone, and thank you for allowing me to share some time with you today. And Heather and everybody always says I scare people, and I actually, that's not what I set out to do. What I set out to do actually is hopefully help you be more aware of what's going on out there in the environment and the things that you need to be aware of as an organization in order to do a better job of protecting your business, your systems, and your information, and most importantly of all, for all of us, is obviously in protecting our patients. So she talked about, I'm the CEO of Synergistic, and just by way of understanding who we are, it's a company that I founded almost 14 years ago now. We focus exclusively in healthcare, and we provide privacy and security services to providers, payers, clearinghouses, and now business associates. So a lot of the examples that I'll use today as we're talking come from obviously our experience working in healthcare, which I think is very important in terms of sharing information among organizations. We're going to have basically 4 primary topics. I'm going to leave time at the end for questions, and I hope that you will put questions into the system so that we can answer those once we're done. So I'm sure everybody understands how to use I think the panel on your screen that where you can actually put a question in. So if you hear something or you want me to explain it further, or go a little bit deeper, or if there's just some other topic perhaps that you're interested in that you've heard about that I don't talk about, feel free to put the question in there, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation. So we're going to talk about the threat a little bit this morning, and specifically we're going to talk about what's going on with ransomware and where that's at and how that's affecting us. We're going to talk about the OCR's permanent audit program, which is well underway, and I had an opportunity just yesterday and the day before to speak with Devin McGraw and some other folks from OCR who are very much involved in that process. We're going to talk about the current enforcement landscape and what's going on there and what we're seeing and the kinds of things that I think folks need to be aware of and what's changing, to include a letter that Jocelyn, the head of OCR, just put out yesterday, and she made it publicly available, but she only put it on their listserv. So unless you're a member of the OCR privacy or security listservs, you would not see that letter. But it was a letter that basically outlined her priorities for enforcement going forward. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we deal with some of these things. And actually, I think I moved that up in the presentation just behind ransomware so that I could talk about it more directly. So with that, let's get started and have some fun here. So let's talk about the threat first. So first of all, it's unfortunately alive and well, and the number of breaches that are occurring out there really took an increase in the third quarter. We saw more in the third quarter than we did the previous 2 quarters, and as you can see, they've kind of built throughout the year. So we had just over 60 breaches, major breaches that occurred in the first quarter of the year, and then 89 in the second, and then 118 in the third. And part of that, we think, is related to additional reporting around a lot of these ransomware attacks and other kinds of attacks that are now reportable that in the past folks might not have realized were reportable, or might not have reported because they didn't realize or recognize that there was compromise potentially involved in those. And we're going to talk about that, how that's changed and how that's affected things. But certainly the level of activity out there has not decreased. What's also interesting are some of the statistics in terms of when we look at those breaches. One of the things we've seen in the last 5 years is we've seen a real demonstrable change in the nature of the threat. So if you go back 5 years ago, the overwhelming predominant type of incident we had was an insider abuse, or a loss or theft of a piece of equipment that had information on it. And we still have those. In fact, the actual number of those types of incidents far outnumbers the number of hacking. And as you can see here, hacking is up to 32%, or was up to 32% of the incidents that were reported in the third quarter. But that's a significant increase over the last 2 years. Last year, that number was less than 20%. The year before that, that number was about 7%. So we've actually seen the percentage of hacking type events that are reported in our breaches in healthcare grow from less than 10% to over 30% in the last 2 years, and that's significant for another reason, and that is that when you look at the number of records that are involved in an individual breach, or in the aggregate, the number of records that are typically involved or compromised in a hacking incident are far greater than the number of records that are involved in either an insider abuse type issue or a theft or loss. And so what we've seen actually in this year, in all of 2015, and actually this so far in 2016, is that well over 90% of the information that has been compromised this year, or the number of records that have been compromised this year, have been attributed to hacking as opposed to all these other events. So basically 30% of the incidents that we're seeing now in healthcare are contributing to over 90% of the damage or the potential harm that we're realizing. Ransomware attacks have also grown exponentially since the third or fourth quarter of 2015. At the end of December of last year, we were seeing about 100 to 200 of these types of attacks a month, a day, and they were pretty consistent, and they were basically of one or two very old varieties. Since December of last year, we have seen ransomware attacks change dramatically, and not only in volume and in intensity and in targeting, but in numbers and types of ransomware attacks that we now see today. We're looking now at about 4,000 of these events a day. We're looking at almost 1,000 different variants, meaning a different type of ransomware attack a day that are being identified. And probably even more alarming is we're seeing 80% of the total number of ransomware attacks that are reported across the country in all industries being targeted at healthcare. So when you look at all of the ransomware attacks that happen, whether they happen to banking institutions, or to energy institutions, or institutions of higher learning, or healthcare, 80% of those ransomware attacks that we see today tend to be focused on the healthcare industry, which means that we have a huge target on our back as it relates to those hackers that are using that approach to trying to compromise our environment. You know, the stakes are high. You know, we have ransomware, which basically falls under the category of cyber extortion, is obviously one of the biggest risks we have today. It's one of the most prominent attack vectors that we see. But we're also seeing all kinds of other activity going on in our environment that we also need to be aware of, and things like cyber espionage, hacktivism, meaning people attacking organizations based on an ideal or an idea, if you will, social issues, targeted attacks that are developed and engineered to attack a particular system or a particular industry or a particular function. Cyber terrorism in terms of attacking devices for the purpose of either harming an organization or harming an individual. And then, of course, just advanced persistent threats and malware. We're seeing well over 400 million malware a year that our threat centers and our systems are registering across the internet. And that's just a huge amount of malicious code that is floating around out there that is affecting anybody that's connected to the internet. And what we're seeing, quite frankly, is that we're ending up with a threat that is very motivated. It's after our data to monetize that information. It's very persistent, meaning that every day when you get up and come to work, or every day when you get up and get connected at home across your home network out to the internet, things are happening and people are trying to take advantage of those systems. And in many cases today, we're seeing that it's becoming very disruptive. We're seeing it affect infrastructure, we're seeing it affect systems, we're seeing it affect communications, and of course this year, as you all know, you've seen multiple cases where hospitals themselves have had their services disrupted for some period of time, which cost them not only from a financial perspective, but more importantly from a reputational perspective and from a confidence with respect to their patients. So this is serious business, and it's something that we need to take serious and be prepared for. So let's drill down a little bit further with respect to ransomware itself. So there are multiple forms of ransomware today. There is crypto ransomware, which essentially attacks the data and encrypts the data and makes it unavailable to the user. There's locker type ransomware, which actually goes after the system that the data is on and locks up the system and makes the system unavailable or the application unavailable to the user, so they still can't get to the data because it's in the system and the system's unavailable. And then we have even newer approaches that we've seen come out just in the last 6 months, where not only do they encrypt the data or encrypt the system or lock up the system, but now they actually will take a copy of the information. So they're actually stealing the information prior to making it unavailable to the organization. So you have both compromise of the information as well as the compromise of the availability. And that's really a new wrinkle, and so which is one of the reasons why we saw the guidance that came out from OCR, which was directed to them by the Congress, and we'll talk about that in a minute and how that applies and what that means. But what we're seeing too is that the ransomware attacks that are out there are becoming much more sophisticated. The attackers are using their own encryption keys to protect their communications. They're using the Onion Router network and other anonymous platforms to allow them to essentially distribute this information and to run these attacks with very little likelihood of being discovered, or at least making it very difficult to discover them. They're using alternative payment methods like Bitcoins, again, to make it very difficult to track who's actually receiving the information. So they're getting, the attackers are becoming very, very sophisticated in how they're doing this and how they're carrying out these attacks. And the attacks themselves are much more sophisticated in the actual malware itself that not only encrypts the data, but erases all copies of the data other than the encrypted copy, so that it's very difficult for the good guys, so to speak, to recover the information without being able to break that encryption. The other thing that's really important to understand about these ransomware attacks, and when you think about it and you think about 4,000 attacks a day, What you're seeing here is an environment where the bad guys have recognized that this is a very successful attack. It is a way for them to make money. And so you have a lot of people that are getting in on the act, so to speak, and a lot of folks who are carrying out these attacks. And they're very indifferent to who the target is. They don't care about whether they're disrupting a hospital system or a bank system or somebody else's system, or locking up your family photos that you've put on your computer, or your music collection that you have on your computer and you've spent thousands of dollars to build. That's all they care about is what can they do to get you to pay money to get that back, whatever that is. So this is something that's attacking us not only at work, it's attacking us at home. It's essentially attacking anybody who has a computer that's connected to the internet and who has not done a good job of protecting that system and making themselves more resilient to these types of attacks. There's also, we've also seen multiple extortion approaches. So at the latter part of last year, we saw what I would call the more traditional approach, where somebody hacked an organization, deployed the ransomware, encrypted their data, and then sent them a message that said, "Pay the ransom, and we'll send you the key, and you can decrypt your data." Since then, we've seen extortion approaches where the person who ran the attack only gives back part of the data for the first payment, and then they ask for a second payment for the rest of the data, and so forth and so on. And what's important to understand about this is that basically you're dealing with a criminal. So you're dealing with somebody who's already done something illegal by breaking into your system. You're dealing with somebody who obviously doesn't have any scruples about disrupting your business, regardless of how important your business is or how critical the support you provide to other people is. You're dealing with somebody who is willing to steal money from you, to give back something that already belongs to you. So it shouldn't be a real surprise that these are individuals who will milk this situation or this for everything it's worth, and try to get as much out of an organization as they can, and which is one of the reasons why, as we'll talk about in a minute as well, why the U.S. Justice Department and most of us that have been involved in this for years are really against paying the ransom if it's at all avoidable. The last thing that's important to understand about ransomware is that it comes at us from multiple directions. It can be malvertising, meaning malware that's attached to a legitimate website and that our users go to from their work computer. It could be spam email, and we know that and we'll talk about that as well, that most email today, if they have a malicious payload, it's generally going to be malware associated with ransomware. It could be a downloader, it could be a botnet, it could be social engineering. You could get it through Facebook or some other mechanism that has been potentially compromised, or a site that's set up to look like a legitimate social site, media site, that someone logs into and then unfortunately receives a package that they weren't expecting. When you look at the growth of ransomware from the organizations that actually track these things, you can see, and this is just only until the end of the first quarter of this year, just the growth alone in ransomware as a type of malware against all other malware that's out there. You notice that by the end of the first quarter of this year, this particular malware had become literally 50% of the malware that we were seeing out there that was being produced. What's even more startling in terms of the delivery mechanism, whoever's moving around their papers, could you please either mute yourself or stop that? If you look at the delivery mechanism today, as I said before, easily 90% or better of the email or the phishing emails or the spam emails that we receive in our inboxes will have, if they have a malicious content to them, will have some form of ransomware. So it's very important that organizations pay attention to educating their users about their email habits, about phishing emails, about how to recognize email that looks suspicious, and not clicking on things that they don't recognize or things that are perhaps from somebody that they don't recognize, because clearly there's a good chance that if it is a phishing email that not only could they end up giving us information that could harm them or assist or aid the attacker or a hacker, but they may actually download malware to their system and cause some problems. Last but not least, it's important to understand the mindset of the attacker that we're dealing with today. This is a very dedicated attacker. This is an attacker, like I said, that doesn't care about what industry we're in or who we are taking care of and how important that is. This is an example of an individual. This particular hacker went by the moniker the Dark Overlord. This person hacked several hospital systems, stealing, as we later found out, over 9 million patient records. He took a small subset of those records back in June, and he went to 3 separate hospitals and said, if I will give you back your data, I will tell you how I hacked your system so that you can fix it, and all you have to do is pay me a fee, and no one has to be the wiser. And so just to underscore the insidious nature of this particular extortion attempt, what he was really doing was he was asking these hospitals to break the law themselves, because what he was telling them was, I already have your data. You've already been breached. You've already been compromised. But all you have to do is pay me and cover this up, not report it like you are obligated to do. And I won't tell anybody, and nobody will have to know. Now, the good news is that none of the hospitals that were given this opportunity took it. They all refused to pay, which then upset him. And so he then posted all 9.3 million records that he had stolen on the dark web for sale on the black market. And then he contacted the media, of all people, and he basically sent them a message that said, you know, next time an adversary comes to you and offers you an opportunity like this, you might want to take it, because it could be a lot more out there that's very harmful. The thing that's really important to understand here is that when we give in to one of these criminals and we do something like this, we essentially have broken the law ourselves, and we haven't made ourselves more secure. We have actually made ourselves less secure, because now not only does the attacker have the advantage of the information that they have stolen, because you don't even know if they gave it all back to you. They may have given you back your information and kept a copy and still gone out and sold it on the dark web. But they also have something that they can hold over you, because all they have to do is expose the fact that you covered it up, and that puts you in an even worse situation than you were before, having to deal with the breach. Now, this individual even went a step further, because after he released the 9.3 million records on the dark web for sale, he then put out on the dark web other information related to an interface engine that he had supposedly hacked, and had discovered how the code for that particular engine and how to compromise it. And he basically put that information out on the web up to the highest bidder, and he did so. And when he did so, he again contacted the media, and he said, the reason I'm doing this is because essentially there's at least 2 buyers out there for this information, and everybody needs to understand that. And the first buyer is somebody who wants to buy it to use it to hack hospitals who use this particular interface engine. And the other buyer is somebody who wants to use it to perhaps create their own interface engine and bypass the cost of development and research and having to create one, when they can just take this code and build one and sell it on the black market themselves to other organizations who perhaps in third world countries would be happy to buy an interface engine that's a knockoff, as opposed to paying full price for one from a manufacturer. So again, this example just kind of shows you who you're dealing with, and it's something that we need to understand, and that our leadership of our organizations needs to understand. So how do we respond when we have one of these incidents? Well, the first thing is we need to understand what type of incident it is. In other words, how did it get there? How was it deposited? Was this something that malware was attached to a phishing mail and it was just an indiscriminate attack, if you will? Or was this an attack where the hacker actually gained access to our network and then deployed the ransomware directly to our systems after already having access to our systems? You know, determine exactly where the incident came from, who was involved, what was done, where it actually happened, and when. And then we need to determine whether or not the incident is finished. Oftentimes we will discover it, and we'll discover it while it's still ongoing, and so we need to understand where we are with respect to that timeline, and making sure that we isolate it, that we stop the flow of information, and that we then eradicate the malicious code and recover the systems and repair our situation. And we need to make sure that we're careful that we do this throughout the system. There, a lot of times we have organizations that respond to a particular incident. They think they've got it isolated. They recover or restore the systems that they think are involved. They reconnect the network, and all of a sudden the outbreak starts all over again, because they find out that they didn't really have a good inventory of all of their systems, and they have a system that's sitting over in another building that they weren't thinking about, that's not in the data center, that was infected as well. And the minute that the network is reconnected, that system starts communicating back with all the rest of the systems and spreads the malware again. So very important to really understand where all your systems are, where your traffic, how your traffic moves across your network, what systems are connected to what or communicate with each other, so that when you go to isolate these things and eradicate them, that you absolutely clear it out throughout your environment before you reconnect and get back doing things. Should you pay the ransom? You know, the U.S. Justice Department says no, we definitely don't want you to do that. I can tell you from my own experience throughout the years, I would prefer we don't pay the ransom. It does not guarantee that you're going to get the information back, or that the attacker still doesn't have other information about you that they could use to harm you. And which is one issue, but the other issue is it obviously will incentivize other attackers to behave similarly, right? And I think that's kind of sort of what we're seeing today, in that these attacks have been so successful in terms of impact as well as response, that a lot of people are saying, hey, this is a worthwhile activity. This is something that I can make money at. And I think right now the last statistic that I heard quoted was that about 40% of the organizations who are hit with ransomware actually end up paying the ransom. And we actually had an organization not too long ago who paid the ransom to get their data back. Typically, the organizations that end up having to pay the ransom to get their data back are ones that do not have good information security. In other words, they don't have good processes in place for recovering and restoring their system. So if we have good recovery procedures, if we have good solid backups of our data, there really is no reason for us to pay these ransoms. We can shut down our network, we can reconfigure, we can restore, rebuild, and then restore, and get back up and running, hopefully in a fairly quick time frame, and not have to be victimized by organizations or individuals who will run these kinds of attacks. But that's really what it's going to come down to, and that's why I'm going to talk in a little bit about how we prepare. Now, one of the things that, as a healthcare organization, you absolutely need to understand is the OCR guidance with respect to ransomware. And this was guidance, by the way, that was essentially forced on them by the U.S. Congress, because Congress was looking at writing legislation actually around ransomware, and fortuitously decided finally that that was not necessarily the right approach. But the Congress sent a letter to the Secretary of HHS and said there needs to be guidance out there so that healthcare organizations understand that ransomware attacks are indeed considered a breach. Because whenever information is disrupted or made unavailable, then it absolutely affects our ability to carry out our primary mission, and it needs to be considered a breach or a compromise at that point. But notification is tied to actual access to data, and so that's different. So the way the guidance is written, and the thing that's important to understand about the guidance, is that if you have a ransomware attack or a ransomware incident, it is a breach. It is a breach, and it's considered a breach. The next step, though, is for you to investigate that breach or that incident and determine exactly what happened and to what extent compromise occurred as it relates to access to the information itself. So if you look at the incident in terms of the manner in which the malware was deployed, and determine that the malware ended up on your system indirectly and was not deployed there by an individual who actually had access to the system or to the data, and the type of malware was such that the ransomware variant that we're dealing with doesn't provide a copy of the information to the attacker, so that literally all that happened was the information was encrypted on your network, or the system was locked up, but the attacker never ever had access to the information itself, then that's not a compromise as it relates to access, and notification is not required. However, if you, in the conduct of your investigation, determine that the attacker did have access to your environment, did have access to the information directly, or did receive a copy of the information prior to encrypting it, then you have to assume that the information was compromised from an access perspective, and that requires notification. So it's a two-step process. One, recognize that it's a breach. Two, conduct that investigation and understand what type of malware was used, how it was deployed, whether or not access to the information itself occurred. And then three, determine whether notification is necessary. So very important to understand that in terms of how you deal with these incidents. Why is this becoming so prevalent? Why is it so easy? Well, it's really simple. The dark web that I've referred to a couple of times already in this presentation is out there, and it is a huge marketplace for folks who would engage in cyber criminal activity. It is extremely easy for somebody to go out there and to acquire a list of emails, to acquire a script for a spear phishing attack, etc., and then to be able to run that attack and to see who responds to it, and then to take those credentials, and then to go back to the dark web, and get download other attacks or acquire other attacks that they can then utilize against that account that they were able to compromise. The ability to set up a Bitcoin wallet or to acquire PGP, which is a free encryption solution for their communications, or to use the Onion Router network or the Tor network and get a Tor browser, is as easy as going to the web itself and looking those things up and understanding the procedure for getting those things. The one thing that I want to make sure I caveat here as I tell you is that never go to the dark web using a computer that's either connected to your home network or to your corporate network, because you might actually end up becoming compromised just by virtue of going to certain sites that are out there. So it's never a smart idea to do that. So don't, whether curiosity is out there or not, you don't want to go tooling around in the dark web to see what's out there and learn about it on any system that is important to your business. So you don't want to do that. But the point is that it's very easy for these folks to do this that want to engage in this kind of activity, and the resources are out there and easily available. So how do we respond to this? Well, there's a couple. I'm going to take it from a couple of perspectives. The first one, I'm going to take it from a programmatic perspective, and then I'm going to talk about it from a technical perspective, if you will. So there are a lot of things that we do that we need to do from a technical perspective to actually address this. But the other thing is we need to understand that our program, first and foremost, has to really be squared away, and that we need to really think about the fact that we're in this struggle. And we need to take the advantage, as I say, take the advantage back. And the first thing we need to do is really do a better job of educating and informing our user community. We need, and this is something that's important, by the way, for the folks that work for you and yourselves, not just at work, but even in your personal lives. You need to understand that ransomware and the things I've talked about are not just things that, again, that affect us at work, but they affect us on any computer that's connected to the network. And that might not be protected properly. So we need to inform our users. We need to make sure that people are smarter about recognizing anomalous behavior on their system, that recognize emails that look suspicious, and that raise the flag and ask for help or ask a question and don't necessarily click on it automatically. We need to think about educating them in terms of where they go on their work computer and what they do on their work computer, and how they use their computer at home, in terms of making sure that after they've gone online and made purchases that they clean out their cache on their system and make sure that those credit cards are not sitting out there waiting for somebody to come by and scoop them up. We need to understand that we need to maintain a current environment, meaning obsolete systems, obsolete software, antiquated applications are literally magnets for attacks. Because typically when a system becomes obsolete or becomes end of life, it's no longer supported, there are no patches that are created for that system anymore. There are no security fixes, if you will, for that system. So if a new vulnerability is identified, that vulnerability is out there, and it's one that the bad guys can exploit and take advantage of. It also when we have antiquated systems or obsolete systems, a lot of times they create interoperability issues in our environment because they don't work with the newest browser, which causes us to have to use an old browser, and then all of a sudden we're subject to any of the attacks that are related to that older version of browser, if you will. One of the things that we need to think about, because often it's a business issue, and we will have an antiquated system or a legacy system, if you will, that we have to maintain because it has critical information on it that we may not be using on a day-to-day basis from a production environment perspective, but we need it every once in a while when a question comes up or when we need to do research back, say, a number of years. And a lot of times people will actually keep these systems on the network. And my recommendation is don't do that. Take them off the network. In other words, don't have them active on the network, so that when they're not being used and they're just sitting there and retaining all this patient information, if you will, that they don't become targets or that they're not accessible through the network. When you need that system, if it's an archive system or an older system that we're just maintaining for record-keeping purposes, when you need that system, connect it to the network. Then do whatever you need to do, and then take it down again. And what this does is it just means that system is not available to the attacker, and therefore it is protected. And so it's something just to think about in terms of how you deal with these kinds of systems. when we develop our strategy for how we build our network, we need to understand that as I said before, attacks come at us from all directions. They come at us from our core, they come at us from endpoints, they come at us from mobile devices, etc. So we need to make sure that as we build out our protections throughout our environment, that we build them out in layers, meaning we build it out in every layer of the enterprise. So from the core to the endpoint, the network layer, the file layer, etc., so that we make it as difficult as possible for the hacker if they gain access to our environment. And then on top of that, we need to deploy what we call complementary controls, which are some newer technologies, which I'll talk about in a minute, that don't take a signature-based approach to security, but take a heuristic approach or a behavioral analysis approach, meaning they're not looking necessarily for the known signature of a bad guy. They're looking for traffic that we don't know or that we don't recognize or that is suspicious in how it looks, and they essentially will stop it or block it and then test it before they allow it to come through the network, so that if indeed it is something that is harmful, it's never allowed to come on the network. If it's not harmful, then it's redirected and allowed to come through. We need to enhance our detection capabilities and recognize from a process perspective that we are in an environment today in most of our health systems and in most of our businesses where the number of actions, if you will, that are created on a daily basis with respect to our systems are numbering in the tens of millions in terms of loggable events from a monthly perspective. And why that's important is that when we're trying to do monitoring and auditing of our environment in a manual way, and you're looking at, in some cases, hundreds of systems and applications, or perhaps even in larger organizations, thousands of systems and applications, and you're looking at literally millions of lines of loggable events, it is impossible to manually digest that much information and identify the things that are important that we need to follow up on. This is why a lot of those professional SOCs or security operations centers that actually do this work have very sophisticated algorithms that they use that allows them to crunch all these millions of loggable events and synthesize it down to the 2 dozen or 3 dozen events that they will report to the organization that they're monitoring, that organization then needs to follow up and troubleshoot to determine whether or not it's an issue. They have the ability to eliminate all of the noise, all of the false positives, etc., which most of us wouldn't even be able to recognize when we're only looking at our own traffic, and we're looking at all that traffic. So it's one of those things that we need the right capabilities to do this. We need newer technology that allows us to recognize these anomalous signatures and recognize all these patterns in our information, and allows us to actually rule out things that are not a threat and focus on the ones that are. And once we've done that from a program perspective, we need to understand that probably the most important phase of any incident response today is how we actually manage contingency planning and respond to an incident, meaning our ability to recognize when we're being attacked, to respond to it in an organized fashion, to isolate the attack, to eradicate it, to restore, and then recover from that incident. And the faster we can do that, the more efficient we can do that, the less of an impact an incident is going to have on our organization, which is translated very quickly to less of an impact to the business. So those organizations that can detect, identify, respond, and then restore very effectively are ones that are going to be least impacted by ransomware type attacks. It just literally allows us to take that advantage back from the attacker. And then last but not least, I tell folks all the time, and I told the audience yesterday, we need to stop being the self-licking ice cream cone. What I mean by that is we got to quit telling ourselves that we're doing a good job, and we need to make sure that we use objective third parties to assess our environment. Organizations that could come in and perform a risk assessment for you, or a security assessment for you, or a penetration test, or a vulnerability assessment, or what have you, not only provide you with an objective look, if you will, at what you're doing, but they also provide you with the benefit of all of their experience in doing that for a whole host of other folks as well. So you not only get the benefit of what they know, their expertise, and how they see your network, which may be different than how you see it, but you also get the benefit of what they have seen in other places that may be very, very much appropriate for you, and actually help you address things that you didn't even know were an issue or could potentially be an issue. So there's a lot of value in taking advantage of those experts that can help you understand where your risk is and how to address it. Okay, so once we've done all that and we kind of have a good strategy and a good approach for how we're going to address these things, then we need to recognize that this is not something we're going to fix with policy. This is not something we're going to fix just through education in terms of users. This is not something that we're going to fix just through changing our culture, although that's very important. But this is something that we are absolutely going to have to apply technology to, because this is a technology issue. We need to first and foremost improve our perimeter, strengthen that perimeter by deploying systems on our perimeter that are smarter about detecting this anomalous behavior. So I'm talking about next generation firewalls that have unified threat management capabilities. I'm talking about having intrusion protection systems that look for suspicious patterns in traffic that's coming at our network. I'm talking about using email and webmail gateways that are very effective at stripping out mail that has malicious content associated with them, or attachments to them, and looking at those attachments and making sure that they're not corrupted. I'm talking about reinforcing our endpoint detection, making sure that we are reducing things like administrative privileges, which hackers absolutely want to. It's the holy grail for them. When an attacker gets on your network, the first thing that they do is they look for a set of elevated privileges that they can compromise. Because once they get a hold of a set of elevated privileges, they then have the ability to turn things off, turn things on, make changes in your network, cover up their tracks with respect to what they're doing, deploy things, execute things. It is an incredibly valuable asset for a hacker to get a hold of. We should be working very diligently to, one, reduce those things, or in my mind, make those things non-persistent. And the way you do that, of course, is you deploy a vaulting solution that basically administrative privileges or elevated privileges just don't exist until somebody needs them, and then they only exist for the time period that somebody is using them, and that they're absolutely audited and tracked the entire time. We need to make sure that we're doing regular testing of our environment. It needs to be fairly frequent. We need to make sure that we are running multiple versions of antivirus if we can, and keeping the signatures up to date. We need that advanced malware detection capability for the anomalous signatures, if you will. And in certain cases, for very critical assets, we need to think about running host-based IPS or IDS on those assets themselves to detect any behavior or any activity that's on that asset that perhaps is not permitted. And last but not least, we need to really start thinking about all the other kinds of devices that we're connecting to our network and how we manage them. So this Internet of Things, if you will, CCTVs, HVAC systems, smart TVs, smart appliances, you name it. Any of these devices that actually communicate and connect to our network are potential vectors that the threat can take advantage of. We need to automate our auditing and monitoring, as I talked about before. I said we couldn't do it manually. Well, we can't, and we need to understand that we need the right technologies to do this, and we need the right kind of support. So a dedicated SOC with enhanced SIM capabilities. A SIM is a system that actually takes the log events from multiple different systems, say a firewall, an IDS, a network controller, a workstation, etc., and correlates those events to understand what's going on in terms of activity or traffic or patterns, and that behavioral analysis and allows us to not only track when something came in, how it happened, where it spread, but that helps us to respond more quickly because we know exactly what we need to respond to and where what systems may have potentially been affected by understanding the pattern of that particular attack. We need to set up our incident response capabilities to include not only our internal capabilities and provide folks with the right training and the right tools to be able to do that effectively, but we also need to include those external organizations to support that so that we have that support when we need it. And last but not least, this is something that I normally didn't talk about in the past, but in my day in the government, we used to set up things called honeypots and honey nets to help deflect or to deceive attackers with respect to where our real network perimeter was and where our sensitive systems or sensitive networks started and ended. And you now can do that in an automated service. So there are actually companies out there that produce software or services where they will deploy a virtual honeynet or honeypot out there that will help obfuscate your network perimeter and make it harder for the bad guys to actually do reconnaissance and explore and figure out exactly how to attack you. And again, what the nice thing about the services now that do that is that we don't have to have that advanced or sophisticated know-how to do that in-house. We can actually acquire that as a service and have really first-rate security at a much lower cost. So with that, let me switch gear, and we're going to talk about the OCR Permanent Audit Program, which is one of our next topics. So the OCR Audit Program permanent program is well underway. It started last June. There were 14,000 covered entities who received their notification from OCR and their survey. Of those 14,000 organizations who received that survey, about 167 of them were actually selected for the desk audit. And those desk audits those CEs were queried on compliance with the security rule as well as the privacy rules. And each one of those 167 organizations that received the desk audit request also were asked to provide a list of all of their business associates, names and contact information for those business associates for those 167 organizations. Essentially starting this past month, October, if you will, about 40 to 50 of those business associates who were identified were selected or will be selected for a desk audit. And those audits will be run between now and the end of the year, hopefully to be completed by the end of the year. And then early in 2017, there will be a small number of organizations, both covered entities and business associates, selected for the comprehensive performance audit, which will be conducted in the spring of next year. So let's talk about what to expect. So and the reason that it's important to understand this is because this is just the beginning of an ongoing program. So next year they will run another series of desk audits somewhere during the year once they complete the comprehensive audits for this fiscal year. And then they will do another set of comprehensive audits, and every year after that there will be a number of organizations selected for both desk audits or comprehensive audits going forward. So the data request that you receive when you receive one of these specifies the content and other electronic information submission requirements. Essentially, you get a message that provides you with a link to to the portal where you are expected to upload this information. You have literally 10 business days to respond to the request. At the end of the 10 business days, that login expires with respect to the ability to upload information, so it's literally not possible to do that afterwards. Only documentation that is submitted on time, it will be reviewed, so it's very important that you get it in within the 10-day time period. All documentation needs to be current as of the date of the request. So in other words, if you got the request this year on June the 11th, and you finalized a policy and signed it on July the 1st, you couldn't submit it. They wouldn't consider it because it wasn't current as of the day of the request. So literally, when you receive your request each year for information that starts the process for your audit, that is the date that is relevant with respect to currency of any information. This is a closed loop process, so the auditors nor the organization are able to contact each other to clarify or ask additional questions, which makes it even more important that the information that you provide is current, is complete, and is accurate and up to date. It is not a good idea to submit extra information. You don't get extra credit in this exercise for doing that. All you really do is increase your exposure and perhaps confuse the auditor who's reviewing the information that you've submitted. And obviously, anybody who fails to respond to the audit request, meaning just literally doesn't provide their information, could be subject to a compliance review. The purpose of all these audits, both the desk audit and the comprehensive audit, is not enforcement. It is literally for OCR to collect information and to do analysis to understand how well compliance is working across the industry. But if somebody doesn't respond, in other words, is negligent with respect to responding to the request for the audit, then that could lead to a compliance review. And what they will do is they will contact the field office that is responsible for your region, and they will open an investigation at that point for non-compliance. So very important that we respond, very important that we respond in a timely fashion. So the actual timeline, again, for the desk audit process is the pre-audit survey. Following the pre-audit survey, there's the notification and data request, which provides a 10-day window for responding. They will review the data that is uploaded to the portal and produce a draft finding, if you will, or a report, which they will then upload back to the portal and notify the covered entity to come review. The covered entity is permitted time to review this draft report and make comment, and then they will produce the final report, which goes to OCR. And that's essentially the process that they follow for the desk audit. The desk audits for this year, in talking about the things that they were looking at the security management process. They were looking at policies and performance of information security risk assessment, and policies and performance of information security risk management. The on-site audits, which will happen, as I said, early 2017, they're going to have an even more detailed focus or more surgical focus, if you will. They're going to be looking at device and media controls, transmission security type issues, encryption of data at rest, and that means encryption of data on multiple device platforms. So that could be at rest on a server, on a workstation, on a laptop, on a thumb drive, on a mobile phone, anywhere where data is resident and could be present. And then last but not least, there are other areas that they will address in these audits are administrative and physical safeguards, workforce training with respect to policies and procedures, and they also are paying attention now to things that came out of the pilot program. So those areas of highest concern during the pilot program may find their way into the areas that they look at during these initial first year audits. Next year they'll look at, they may look at the results of the previous year, and any areas that seem to be a pattern or higher in terms of risk may show up on the successive year audits. And they're looking at breach and incident reports that are submitted to OCR as well. So they're looking at patterns in the breaches that they're seeing, they're looking at patterns in the complaints that they're seeing, and they're saying, are these areas that we need to assess as part of our audit program, and they're including those as well. This is the actual, these are the actual questions, I should say, that were part of the desk audits that were received this year. So as it related to the risk analysis, people were asked to upload documentation on their current risk analysis. They were asked to upload information with respect to the previous risk analysis that was performed. And then they were asked to upload information with respect to the actions that they had taken as it related to those two risk analysis. So they're not only looking to see that you're conducting one, that you're conducting it accurately and correctly, but they're also looking to see that you have conducted them on a regular basis by asking for not only the current one but previous one, and they're looking at what is the periodicity between those two risk analysis, and then they're focusing on what did you do about the things that were identified in that particular risk analysis as well. With respect to risk management, again, they wanted you to upload documentation demonstrating that you had implemented security measures to reduce the risks that you had identified in those risk analysis. So did you create a remediation plan? Did you create a risk management plan that says, we identified a risk with unencrypted devices, and we have a plan in place to encrypt those devices, and that we followed through on that. And again, they're looking at not only did you document the things that you said you were going to do, but in fact, did you actually do those things? And so for each of these, you not only had to produce these plans, organizations had to produce these plans, but they had to actually produce the documentation that demonstrated that they had done these things. As it related to breach notification, basically the question that was presented to organizations, or the requirement, using a sampling methodology, upload documentation of 5 breach incidents for the previous calendar year affecting less than 500 individuals, so smaller breaches. And then using a sampling methodology, upload documentation of 5 breaches for incidents in the previous calendar year affecting greater than 5,000 individuals. So if you had a major breach, then you had to upload the information related to that breach. And if you had smaller breaches that you reported, those two, that information had to be uploaded again, up to 5 of each of those. And then they asked for other information like standard template form letters or other things that you use for notifying individuals, etc. And then they were looking for, basically they were looking for, did you document the incident? Did you investigate it? Did you use the process for determining whether or not there was risk of compromise? And if you did, what was your rationale for either notifying or not notifying? And then what did your notification look like? And who did that notification go to? So a very detailed set of documents that they were looking for with respect to any breaches that you might have experienced and that you might have reported. If you look at it from a privacy perspective, those organizations that were asked the privacy questions, upload all documentation related to the first 5 access requests which were granted and evidence of fulfillment in the previous calendar year. Upload all documentation related to the last 5 access requests which were granted and evidence of fulfillment for the previous year. And then last but not least, upload policies and procedures for individuals to request and provision of access to their health information. So again, it was all around access to information. It was all around how you handle that process. And what was important here was the documentation that you create when you receive those requests for access and how you handle them and how you actually can demonstrate that you met that request. So very detailed set of questions that they asked in the desk audit, and you had to basically produce the information, and you're literally relying on the information that you provided to them in this process to demonstrate that you had met that requirement. So let's talk about the comprehensive audits that'll start in the spring. These are going to be very much like the audits that were performed under the pilot program, with the one exception that these will be much more focused in scope and not as broad. So under the pilot program, those audits tended to be very broad in scope and very inclusive of privacy, security, and the breach notification rule. Under the permanent program, the expectation is that the process that they follow will be very similar. The approach that they use in terms of using the generally accepted government audit standards in terms of how they conduct the audit will be the same, but the focus of the audits will be much more narrow, much more focused, and it will either be, generally it will either be security and the breach rule or privacy. And so organizations won't be literally hit with this massive audit that was very time consuming and very difficult to respond to. Again, the process itself is not changed. There'll be a notification, which will be a formal notification, if you will, via registered mail, so that somebody has to receipt for it. There will be a minimum amount of time that is permitted in terms of reviewing the request for documentation and providing that information, upload that information to the portal, if you will. Past that, they will review the information before they come on site. There will be a series of calls that are made between the audit team and the site to coordinate the visit and to coordinate the support that they're going to require, if you will. They will come on site for between 3 to 10 days, depending on the size of the organization that they're auditing, to actually do the data collection and site visit. And then they will exit and conduct their analysis and write their draft report, which will then be backloaded, uploaded to the portal again for the organization to review, and there'll be a period of 10 days for the organization to conduct that management review and respond to that report, and then a final report will be produced and sent to OCR headquarters. This is a notional timeline. Some may go a little faster, some may go a little slower, but they're hoping that they will be able to do these in a very efficient manner by narrowing the scope of what they're going to look at and the amount of information that they have to collect and review. The information request in terms of the data that they will ask for at the beginning of the audit has not changed, as far as I understand, from the list that was put together under the pilot program. But if it is, or if it does change, that list will be updated and provided on their website so that organizations know ahead of time the kinds of information that they're going to be asked to produce. The kinds of areas that they're going to address under the comprehensive program, at least what they've identified. Under breach notification, you see the areas there under privacy and under security. Under security, you'll notice that it's a more broad area, or a broad listing, if you will. But if you remember the slide a couple slides ago where I talked about what they said they're going to focus on, those are the areas, at least, that they've identified for the 2016 audit period that they're going to focus on. So you want to be prepared for, obviously, for anything, but those are the areas that they have identified as a priority. With respect to business associates, who will also be audited, the same thing. They expect that very few business associates will have a privacy component to their audit. but there may be some business associates who are actually performing services for covered entities that get them involved in privacy matters, and if there are, then those can be included in their audit as well. There's some references here. I'm not going to dwell on these, but there's some references here that can perhaps help you with respect to the audit program. There's two here. There's two more here. In addition to that, we've actually produced an OCR Audit Tool Kit that takes the audit protocol and turns it into a training mechanism and readiness mechanism for our hospitals. We provide that freely to all of our hospitals, and if anybody is interested in that, you can talk to Heather and she can get to me, and I'll make sure that somebody gets you a copy of that for you to look at. Okay, so let's talk about enforcement, which I think is our last topic today before we get to questions, and I hope hopefully folks have identified some questions. So enforcement is actually increasing. There have been 281,000 breaches reported to HHS since 2010, which is a pretty significant number. There have been a little over 1,600 large breaches, meaning breaches involving greater than 500 records, that have affected a large number of people that have also been reported in that time frame. 60% of those incidents were due to loss or theft of unencrypted devices or media, which is one of the reasons why that's such a big focus in the audits. And it's one of the reasons that OCR really focuses on those incidents involving unencrypted devices, because one of their things that they've said over and over again recently is that organizations should know by now that if they're going to put or allow PHI to go onto a device, that device needs to be encrypted. Hacking IT network breaches accounted for a large number of records exposed, and that number is growing, and the percentage of those incidents is growing as well, as I talked about earlier. And business associates now account for roughly 25%, thereabout, of the breaches that we see reported. In addition to that, as you know, they receive countless complaints each year with respect to organizations from a privacy and security perspective, and you see the number of complaints down there. What this tells you is that OCR has a tremendous workload, because OCR is obligated to investigate all of the breaches that involve greater than 500 records, so all of the major breaches. But they're now looking into the smaller breaches as well as the complaints as well. So there's a tremendous amount of effort that is being focused on enforcement as it relates to the number of incidents that are out there. There has been a change in their focus with respect to that, and I'm going to talk about that at the end, though, so you understand what that is. They have collected almost $25 million in violations, or fines, if you will, associated with breaches. They have used that money very effectively to create automation with respect to their tools, the portal that they use for the audits, the databases now that allow them to track breaches as well as complaints, so that they can discern patterns in organizations when things are reported or things or complaints come in, as well as support their audit and investigative activities. They've used that money to acquire contracts with contractors to support them in both the investigative process as well as the audit process. And so most of that money has been used to support the infrastructure, if you will, that supports their enforcement activities. Key issues highlighted in resolution agreements that we see, business associate agreements comes up over and over again, risk analysis in terms of not either being current or not being complete or not being correct or not being followed up on seems to be recognized over and over again. Failure to manage identified risk. This is in terms of you identified something with your risk assessment, or and you didn't do anything about it. So in other words, you identified that you didn't have devices encrypted, and yet you had a breach that involved an unencrypted device. Again, no patching of software, poor vulnerability management practices, obsolete systems, insider threats, improper disposal, information that's not tracked all the way to its final destruction. And last but not least, insufficient data backup and contingency planning, which obviously ransomware has put a very bright spotlight on this for a lot of organizations, because when you have one of those incidents and your system goes down and you cannot restore it because you don't have good backups or don't have good contingency plans, it automatically signals a red flag for OCR. Some of the case studies that are out there, some of these you may have seen, but just to, the thing that's important to understand about a lot of these is that some of them are large organizations, some of them are medium-sized organizations, and some of them are not so large organizations. So Catholic Health Care Services of Philadelphia was a typical organization that was not a huge organization, but it essentially was the victim of an unencrypted device that had PHI on it, and as a result they received a pretty hefty penalty, as well as a corrective action plan to fix these things. What was really the thing, though, that was common about this incident that people need to understand is that what caught OCR's attention was the unencrypted device that had the PHI on it, but what really earned them their corrective action plan and their fine was what OCR found when they came in and did the investigation and realized that this organization had not conducted risk analysis, did not have a risk management plan, and essentially had this vulnerability and had not addressed it properly. Oregon State Health Sciences University paid a pretty hefty fine with respect to issues that they had. These were multiple issues that came to light that basically demonstrated a pattern of not addressing the protection of information as it related to not only devices that information ended up on, but services that they allowed employees to use that they didn't have a way of controlling. So it's not just important that we think about where our data is as it relates to the devices that are under our control, perhaps, or that we permit, but also that we're thinking about, do we allow users to go get the public version, for instance, of Dropbox or GitHub, a GitHub account, or in this case, Google Drive Mail, where they actually use publicly accessible tools to transmit protected health information, not necessarily, because they're trying to do something wrong, but they're literally trying to get their jobs. A lot of times this falls into the category of what we call shadow IT, but we need to pay attention to that, because when that happens and that gets out into the public and it gets reported, then we're going to find ourselves in a situation like Oregon Health Sciences did, where they paid a pretty hefty price as a result of this. Under the Accountable Care Act, certain organizations are designated to manage that program for different areas, and so the University of Mississippi Medical Center was one of those. They too ended up with a pretty hefty fine and a corrective action plan, again, as it related to a missing laptop that was not encrypted, that had protected health information on it. They also, that's what got them there, but once they got there, they also discovered that protected health information was stored in other areas that were not secure, and that individuals could access patient information by virtue of a generic username or a password, so there was no accountability as to who was accessing the information. And in this case, the administrators for the system were actually aware of this, and didn't take action to mitigate it, which means it was basically negligence. So unfortunately, they too received a fine. So if we know something, we have to address it. And not knowing something, by the way, I've heard people say, well, I don't want to do risk assessment because I don't know what I need to fix, and if I know what I need to fix, then I could be held responsible. If you don't do that risk assessment, you are still responsible, because not doing the things that are recognized as required or common sense, and so that you do know what you need to address, is the same thing as knowing it and not doing it. So it's important to keep that in mind. Advocate Health System, this is a very large system, as many of you may be aware of this. They have many facilities all over around the Illinois area. They ended up paying a significant fine, and this is the first case that we've had in a while that not only received a fine and a corrective action plan, but also must have a monitor. So in this particular case, Advocate not only has to pay the fine and correct the things that were identified in their investigation, but they also have to engage an independent third party to monitor what they do for the next 2 years and report to OCR that they indeed are living up to their resolution agreement and their corrective action plan. So it's a pretty significant investment that Advocate is going to have to make as a result of this issue. There were 3 different breach notification reports affecting a large number of people that was involved here. Involved numbers of stolen systems that were not protected properly, as well as a third party that had access to their network. And what OCR really focused on in this case, which is important to understand, is that they not only look at what happened, but they look at the duration that these events occurred over, and how long and how widespread they were. So Advocate's penalty was really based more on how long this went on and how broad it was, as opposed to just the fact that they had unencrypted devices or unprotected devices, which many other organizations have had as well. I put these in here just so we can make sure that people understand that enforcement is not just about big organizations or large organizations. It's also about small organizations as well. And this is an example of 3 smaller organizations who had incidents, who were investigated, and who were awarded fines and or corrective action plans with respect to the things that were discovered during their investigation. So enforcement is not just about, like I said, they're not just focusing on large organizations. Typically what they're doing is they're looking at the breach report when it comes in, or the complaint when it comes in, and they're looking for evidence of neglect or negligence or trends that speak to long periods of something not being addressed. So it's more about the nature of your incident than the size of the organization. What do we expect going forward? Well, this was an excerpt of the high points that were in the letter that was just published this week to the OCR privacy and security listservs. And in that letter, Ms. Samuels outlined essentially her focus going forward with respect to enforcement. She said it's going to be laser focused on breaches at healthcare entities with complaints of systemic non-compliance, meaning, as I said before, long, over and over again, same type of complaint or same type of incident over a period of time where it doesn't look like the organization is addressing the issue. They're going to be focused on investigating the root cause of incidents to determine the non-compliance that led to the breach. So in other words, they're not, when they come in and investigate, they're not just going to look at the incident itself. They're going to look at your entire program and determine what led to this breach. It wasn't just that a laptop wasn't encrypted. What else is it? Was there a risk assessment performed? Did we even know that this issue existed. Is there a process issue here? So they're going to look at what actually led up to the actual incident. They're going to seek resolution agreements and corrective action plans in cases where they may be the only remedy that impacts the greatest number of people. So again, they're not, it's not about just seeing more corrective action plans or resolution agreements or more fines. It's about using that when nothing else is going to work. So a lot of this speaks to the nature of how an organization responds to the incidents that they have and how they respond to OCR. Organizations that respond responsibly, organizations that respond with energy in terms of how they're going to respond to it and correct the problems, stand to fare much better in dealing with OCR when they've had an incident than organizations who don't take it as seriously, if you will. And then resolution agreements will serve as a template for proactive action to ensure compliance. So what they're saying is they want their resolution agreements to actually be instructive to the community with respect to the kinds of things that they need to be concerned about. So you can actually go in and read all the resolution agreements that have been finalized and see what they are looking at and the things that they care about and the things that they focus on in those resolution agreements and the corrective action plans, and kind of look at your own program and say, oh, am I addressing that, or do I have an issue there? And that's really what they would like folks to do. Okay, and with that, we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to let Heather tell me if we have any questions, and if we do, I'll take those.
All right. If you would submit your questions to the chat function, that would be great. Pull that up. All right. Here is a question for you. Could you explain what is the dark web?
Sure.
Because some of us are wondering, including myself.
So the dark web is essentially a part of the internet, if you will, that has been created by the hacker community that provides for sites where individuals can list or sell or share information that is, I guess you could say, less than desirable, meaning the dark web is essentially an underworld marketplace for hackers and for other folks who would engage in cyber criminal activity to go and acquire just about any service you can imagine. Meaning, you can, as I said, you can buy lists of stolen data, you can buy email lists that have been stolen, you can buy tools to hack people, you can buy courses on hacking, you can buy services, so you can actually hire somebody as a service to run an attack for you. Just about anything you can imagine that is related to cyber criminal activity is available on the dark web.
All right. Well, that doesn't sound like a place where we want to go, ever. Another question. You mentioned earlier in the presentation about clearing the cache after credit card use. Is that something you would also recommend even on a personal basis, with your own home computer?
In fact, that's what I was referring to, and it was really interesting. I was talking to a professor yesterday after a presentation that I had given here at the AHIMA conference, and we were talking about this issue, and we were talking about two-factor authentication, and which is one of the things that I am a huge fan of, and I wish that everybody, both in their personal and in their business lives, would implement two-factor authentication in their environment, because that one step alone will make it makes it much more difficult for somebody to compromise them, even when they fall victim to a phishing attempt, if you will. And yet, as he and I were talking, I asked him. I said, "Do you do online purchasing on your computer at home?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, do you have two-factor authentication on your bank account? Do you have two-factor authentication on your email? Do you have two-factor authentication on, other applications that are important to you that are on that computer? And he said, no. He goes, I didn't do that because I don't. He goes, I didn't want to have to be bothered with it. And I said, well, that's good. I said, the hackers appreciate the fact that you don't want to be bothered. Just makes their job that much easier. And I said, when you go out there and you buy something online, I said, after you finish with that transaction, I said, do you go in and clean out the cache on your computer? And he goes, I don't even know what that is. He goes, why would I do that? And I said, well, interestingly enough, when you make online purchases, oftentimes your credit card number, after you put it in the program, is actually still captured in the cache that's part of your system there. And I said, and there are programs out there that if your network is not protected properly, hackers can come in, compromise your system, and run a very simple program to essentially vacuum all the information out of your cache, acquiring your passwords, your credit card numbers, etc., that you have been plugging in there all day long while you were going about your business. And I said, and if you don't have anything better than a modem or a router in front of your network at home, not that most home office firewalls are any better because they've all been compromised, you basically are very much at risk. I said, so it's not just that we need to be smarter about how we use our information and how we access systems, and do the things that make it more difficult for the bad guys to take advantage of it. So that cache that's on your system at home, you can go into your settings, go into privacy and security, and you can go in there and you can clear your cache out periodically, and you should always do it after you've made online purchases and plugged in any important number, whether it's a password or a credit card number, if you will. You can also use password systems that allow you to have anonymous passwords and much more difficult passwords on your system that make that more difficult as well. So there's all kinds of things that you can do. I mean, even things like Google Mail today have the Google Authenticator, so you can put a second factor on your mail. You can put a second factor on your Google apps. So not doing that is, quite frankly, it's I hate to say it, but it's a little bit of laziness, and it's pretty risky.
Another question for you, and this will be the last one since we're running out of time, but if you're doing work, say on your iPhone with your, obviously your company's email, is there a greater risk there to being hacked because, you just put your password into your phone and you pull it up and there you are?
It can be. Again, it's a matter of again, what you're doing and how you're doing it. So if you, the iPhone, first of all, everybody I think should know that texting on an iPhone is now all encrypted. You can actually encrypt your mail. You can put a second factor on your mail that's tied to a certificate that's on your phone. You can actually deploy the Google Authenticator, for instance, on your iPhone if you're using Google Mail, which requires that second factor to get into your mail. You can actually put stronger passwords on your phone than what the phone itself allows. You don't have to use the PIN, and I don't recommend using the PIN. You should put a stronger password on your phone. You can actually use the biometric, your thumbprint or fingerprint, whatever, with respect to your phone as well. So there are lots of security features that you can now deploy on the applications that you have on your phone as well as your phone itself, that if you take advantage of those, are you 100% secure? Absolutely not. We're never ever 100% secure, but you can make it more difficult for somebody to compromise your phone or compromise your information if you're just smart about how you use it.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, as always, Mac. Thank you for being able to provide this to our folks out there. If you do have any questions, you can certainly reach out to Mac. As far as the materials,
So I can't hear Heather at the moment, so I don't know whether she's still there or not. But thank you very much for letting me share time with you today. I hope that you got something out of it. And by all means, if you have a question, send it to either Heather or myself, and I'll be happy to answer it. Thank you very much.